She reached across the tray table, wrapped her fingers around the plastic tubing of my daughter's oxygen line, and yanked it clean out of the portable ventilator before I could even get my hand up to stop her. My daughter's lips went from pink to gray in 11 seconds. I know it was 11 seconds because I counted every single one of them out loud, and every person in first class heard me counting. I remember the exact texture of that moment more than I remember almost anything else in my life. The recycled cabin air suddenly felt thin in my own lungs, like my body was trying to breathe for both of us at once. I remember the small plastic click the disconnected tubing made bouncing off the tray table. I remember the particular gray, not pale, not sick-looking, but gray the way a winter sky is gray right before it snows, spreading across my daughter's lips while her eyes went wide and confused and searching for mine. For one terrible stretch of time that felt endless but was, by the clock on my phone, exactly 11 seconds, I was not a mother with any authority at all. I was just a woman on her knees in a first-class aisle, one hand cradling her daughter's face, watching the color drain out of it while a cabin full of strangers froze around us, uncertain whether to help or simply get out of the way. Adrian was already moving toward us before I even called his name, some instinct in him recognizing an emergency before I'd fully processed it myself. The woman who had done this sat frozen in her own seat, mouth slightly open, the mask still dangling loosely from her fingers as though she hadn't fully registered yet what those 11 seconds actually meant. I need to take you back to how this all started, because none of what happened in that cabin makes sense without understanding exactly who was sitting in seat 2A, and exactly who was sitting beside her without the faintest idea what she'd just done. 6 hours earlier, I had walked onto that airplane the same way I walk onto every airplane, which is quietly, politely, and completely unnoticed. I had a badge in my jacket pocket that not one person on that flight knew about. I had spent the last 11 years of my life being underestimated by rooms full of powerful people, and I had learned that being underestimated is not a weakness. It is a weapon if you know how to hold it. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, not the flight attendants, not the businessman in 2C scrolling through his phone, not the woman in the blue blazer with her sunglasses pushed up into a blowout that had clearly cost more than most people's car payments, was exactly who she had just made the biggest mistake of her life against. My name is Diane Whitfield. I'm 46 years old, and I live in a quiet brick colonial outside Alexandria, Virginia, the kind of house where the porch light stays on and the mail gets picked up by a neighbor when we travel. I drink my coffee black, I forget to water my ferns until they're nearly crisp, and I have a laugh that my daughter says sounds like a seal barking, which is probably true, because my husband has recorded it on his phone twice now just to prove it to me. I am, in most ways that matter to the people who bag my groceries or wave at me at the elementary school pickup line, a completely ordinary woman. I grew up in a small town outside Richmond where my father ran a hardware store and my mother taught 4th grade for 31 years. Nobody in my family had ever worked in Washington. Nobody in my family had ever imagined a daughter or granddaughter would end up where I ended up, and honestly, for a long time, neither did I. I went to a state school on a partial scholarship, studied public policy because it seemed practical, and fell into government work almost by accident the way a lot of us do, one internship leading to one staff position, leading to one campaign, leading to a career you never quite meant to build but somehow did anyway. My first real job in this world was answering constituent phone calls in a district office in Southern Virginia, fielding complaints about potholes and Social Security checks that hadn't arrived and, more than once, people who just wanted someone in a position of authority to listen to them for 5 minutes. I did that for 2 years before anyone trusted me with anything more significant, and I think that experience shaped me more than any of the offices I've held since. It taught me that most people who seem unreasonable are usually just frightened or unheard, and that patience, real patience, not performed patience, is the single most underrated tool in any position of power. It also taught me, eventually, to recognize the difference between someone who is frightened and unheard, and someone who is simply cruel and has never once in her life faced a consequence sharp enough to teach her otherwise. Those two types of people can sound remarkably similar in the first 30 seconds of a conversation. It is only in the next several minutes, in how they respond to basic decency being extended toward them, that the real difference reveals itself. But in my line of work, I had learned to stay calm in situations most people could never imagine. I had sat across tables from men who could end careers with a phone call and women who could move markets with a single sentence, and I had learned that the loudest person in the room is rarely the most dangerous one. I had faced far more dangerous situations than a first-class airplane cabin. That afternoon, none of that mattered to me. That afternoon, the only thing that mattered to me was the little girl asleep against the window seat beside me. Her small chest rising and falling in that careful rhythm that took us 4 years and 2 hospitals to get right. I think people assume that a life like mine comes with some kind of permanent armor, that once you've sat in enough rooms with enough consequence hanging in the air, ordinary indignities stop reaching you at all. That has never been true for me, not once. I remember early in my career a mentor of mine, a woman named Congresswoman Patterson who has since passed, telling me that the day the small cruelties of the world stop bothering you is the day you've lost the thing that made you worth electing in the first place. I have carried that with me through 11 years of increasingly larger rooms, through a Senate confirmation hearing that lasted 9 hours, through a diplomatic incident overseas that very nearly ended in an actual crisis, through 100 smaller humiliations that come with being a woman in rooms that were built, historically, without women in mind. None of it ever fully calloused me over, and I am, most days, grateful for that, even on the days it costs me something. I also want you to understand something about the particular exhaustion of that day, because it matters for what happened later. We had chosen Orlando specifically because it was one of the only trips on the calendar that entire year with absolutely no security detail, no press advance team, no staff traveling separately in case anything needed my attention. Mark had arranged it, quietly, through a friend at the Charity Partnership Program, specifically so that for 3 days, Lily could just be a kid at a theme park instead of the daughter of someone whose face occasionally turns up on the evening news. That anonymity was a gift I had fought to protect fiercely, and it is the exact reason nobody on that airplane had the faintest idea who I was until I chose to tell them. I flew coach class rules in every other part of my life during that trip. I stood in the same lines as every other parent. I wiped the same sticky ice cream off Lily's chin with the same napkin every other mother in that park was using. For 3 days I got to just be Diane, and something about how precious that anonymity had become to me made its violation, later on that plane, feel even sharper than it might have otherwise. My vulnerability, if you want to call it that, is simple. I have spent so many years being strong for other people that I sometimes forget how to ask for help for myself. My husband, Mark, tells me this all the time. He tells me I will run myself into the ground before I ever say the word tired out loud. He wasn't on that flight with us. He'd flown back 2 days earlier for a work commitment he couldn't move, and there is a part of me that has thought, more than once since that day, about how differently things might have unfolded if he had been sitting in that aisle seat instead of empty space and a stranger. That afternoon, exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with sleep and everything to do with 3 days of theme parks and hospital-grade vigilance, I was not thinking about myself at all. I was thinking about getting my daughter home safely, the way I think about almost nothing else when we travel. I want to tell you one small, specific thing about myself before I go any further, because I think it matters. I am afraid of failing my daughter in ways no one can see. Not the big, dramatic failures. I know how to handle a medical emergency. I know how to fill out an insurance appeal at 11 at night. I know how to sit in a hospital hallway for 6 hours without falling apart in front of her. What terrifies me is the small failures. Forgetting a spare battery. Packing the wrong adapter. Not noticing quickly enough when something is wrong. That fear lives in me every single time we fly, a low hum underneath everything else. And it was humming louder than usual that day, because Lily had had such a good few days that I think some small superstitious part of me was waiting for something to go wrong. Her name is Lily. She is 7 years old, and if you spent even 5 minutes with her, you would understand exactly why every single person on that flight fell in love with her before the trouble ever started. Lily has 3 things about her that make her impossible not to adore. The first is that she narrates everything, quietly, to herself, like a tiny nature documentarian doing a segment only she can hear. She'll look at a cloud and whisper, "That one is shaped like a walrus who is late for something." And then she'll look genuinely satisfied with the observation, the way a scientist looks satisfied after confirming a hypothesis. The second is that she collects other people's smiles the way some kids collect rocks or bottle caps. If a stranger smiles at her in an airport or a grocery store, she remembers it, tucks it away somewhere, and brings it up days later, completely unprompted, out of nowhere, in the middle of an entirely unrelated conversation. "Remember that man at the gas station who smiled at me? I think he was having a good day." The third thing about Lily is that she is one of the bravest people I have ever met in my entire life, and I have met some genuinely brave people. Marines, surgeons, a woman who once talked a gunman down from a hostage situation over the phone. Lily's bravery is quieter than any of that, but it is not smaller. 2 years ago, a rare autoimmune condition attacked the nerves running from Lily's spinal cord to her diaphragm. In simple terms, the muscles that let her breathe on their own stopped listening to her brain's instructions, slowly at first, then all at once, over the course of about 6 terrifying weeks that I still cannot think about without my chest tightening. She spent 4 months in a hospital bed while doctors figured out how to keep her alive, first on a full ventilator, then gradually weaned to something less invasive, and she came out the other side needing a portable ventilator, a small quiet machine with a mask and a tube that does the work her own lungs can no longer reliably do on their own, especially under the stress of altitude and pressurized cabin air. She is not on it every hour of every day anymore. Her home life is mostly normal school. Soccer she can't quite keep up with but insists on playing anyway. Sleepovers with careful planning. But on airplanes, with the pressure changes and the recycled air, her pulmonologist, a soft-spoken man named Dr. Okafor who has become something like family to us, is firm. The mask stays on for takeoff, landing, and any period of turbulence. No exceptions. We do not negotiate on this. Not with airlines, not with gate agents, not with anyone. Lily has one habit that is entirely her own, something none of us taught her and none of us have ever asked her to do. Every single time she puts that mask on, she taps it twice with her index finger, gently, like she's saying hello to it, like it's a friend rather than a machine, like it's something she trusts rather than something she has to endure. She started doing that in the hospital during the 2nd month, when a nurse named Renata first introduced her to a smaller pediatric mask after weeks on something much bulkier and more frightening, and none of us ever told her to keep doing it, and none of us have ever asked her to stop. I remember the day Renata first showed Lily that smaller mask with unusual clarity, because it was one of the only genuinely hopeful moments in an otherwise brutal stretch of months. Lily had spent the previous 6 weeks terrified of the larger mask, the one that covered nearly her whole face and made her feel, in her own words at the time, like a monster in a movie. Renata knelt down at her bedside, held the smaller mask up to the light so Lily could see through the clear plastic, and told her it was going to be her breathing buddy, something that worked with her rather than against her. Lily reached out, hesitant, and tapped it once, almost accidentally, and Renata laughed and said, "There you go, say hello to your buddy?" And Lily tapped it a 2nd time, deliberately this time, and something in her small shoulders relaxed for the first time in weeks. That 2-tap greeting has never once left her since, through dozens of subsequent mask replacements, through 2 different pulmonologists, through countless flights and car rides and overnight stays, always the same small private ritual between a 7-year-old and the machine that keeps her breathing. Her days now, most days, look remarkably ordinary, which is exactly what we fought so hard for 2 years ago and exactly what I try never to take for granted. She goes to a public elementary school not far from our house, where her teacher, a patient, thoughtful woman named Miss Patterson, has built a classroom culture where Lily's occasional need to step out for a breathing check is treated with the same unremarkable normalcy as another child's trip to the water fountain. She has 2 best friends, Priya and Deshawn, who fight over who gets to push her wheelchair on the days her legs feel too tired, and who have both, independently and without prompting from any adult, learned exactly how to help her reattach her mask if it slips during recess. She still narrates the world to herself in that same quiet documentary voice, still collects strangers' smiles like small treasures, still insists on playing soccer even on days her body clearly isn't quite up for it. Because, as she puts it, sitting out feels worse than being tired. I tell you all of this not because it directly relates to what happened on that flight, but because I think it matters for you to understand exactly what kind of ordinary, resilient, joyful life this woman decided, for the length of one airplane ride, that she had the right to disrupt. Lily is not a symbol. She is not a lesson. She is a specific 7-year-old girl who likes purple more than any other color, who cannot stand the texture of tomatoes, who cried during the sad part of nearly every animated movie she has ever watched, and who, on an otherwise wonderful Tuesday afternoon, had a stranger decide her ability to breathe safely mattered less than that stranger's mood. That day, before any of this happened, Lily was having the best day she'd had in months. We were flying home from Orlando, where she had spent 3 days meeting the character actors at a theme park who had been specially briefed by the airline's charity partnership program. One of those quiet arrangements corporate offices set up and rarely publicize. to spend extra time with her, to make sure she didn't feel like the kid on the sidelines while other children ran through the water features she couldn't safely join. She had a stuffed elephant clutched against her side that a park employee named Marcus had given her personally, kneeling down to her wheelchair level to hand it over like it was a knighthood ceremony. She had a temporary tattoo of a butterfly on her wrist that she kept showing to anyone who made eye contact, announcing, unprompted, "It's a monarch. They migrate thousands of miles," Marcus told me. She laughed so hard at one point during boarding, at something the flight attendant said about turbulence being the plane's way of dancing, that she nearly choked on her apple juice, and I had to pat her on the back while she giggled through the coughing, tears streaming down her face from laughter rather than distress. I remember thinking, in that exact moment, that I had never seen my daughter so purely, uncomplicatedly happy, and some part of me wanted to freeze that second in amber and keep it forever. There is one more memory from that trip I want to give you before I move forward, because I think about it constantly now, more than almost anything else from those 3 days. On our second night in Orlando, we sat by the hotel pool after hours, past when Lily should have been asleep, both of us too wound up from the day to settle down properly. She was watching the water, mask off, just breathing on her own the way she still could for short stretches when she was calm and rested, and she turned to me out of nowhere and said, "I like today better than yesterday because nobody looked at me weird today." I asked her what she meant, and she shrugged in that particular 7-year-old way that means the conversation is both enormously important and also entirely casual, and she said, "Sometimes people look at my mask like it's scary. Marcus didn't. He just talked to me like a regular kid." I remember sitting very still after she said that, turning the sentence over in my mind long after she'd finally fallen asleep against my shoulder, because it told me something about her life I hadn't fully let myself absorb before, that even in a world where we did everything right, where every doctor's appointment was covered, where every accommodation was made, my daughter still carried a private inventory of who had made her feel normal and who had made her feel strange, and she was keeping score in a way no 7-year-old should ever have to. That is the moment this woman destroyed. She had boarded 10 minutes after us, moving down the aisle of that Delta flight from Orlando to Washington Dulles like the aisle itself was inconveniencing her by existing. She was maybe mid-50s, dressed in an expensive blazer the color of a swimming pool, sunglasses pushed up into hair that had clearly been blown out that same morning, the kind of woman who moves through the world assuming every space was designed with her comfort as the single organizing principle. Her body language told you everything before she ever opened her mouth. The way she stood in the aisle a full 10 seconds longer than necessary while a gate agent finished stowing a bag for the elderly passenger ahead of her, arms crossed, sighing loud enough for 3 rows to hear, checking her watch with theatrical impatience even though the flight was, in fact, boarding exactly on schedule. She carried a designer tote bag in the crook of one arm and a garment bag over the other shoulder, both clearly expensive, both handled with the particular carelessness of someone who has never once had to worry about the cost of replacing something. She snapped at the gate agent on her way down the jet bridge that the boarding process was unnecessarily slow today, even though, from what I could see through the cabin window, boarding was proceeding at exactly the same pace it always did. She had the specific energy of someone perpetually irritated by a world that was, by any objective measure, functioning perfectly normally around her. The energy of someone who has spent so many years mistaking other people's patience for the natural order of the universe that any friction at all, however minor, registers to her as a personal offense. Her first words to anyone on that plane were directed at the flight attendant checking boarding passes. "I specifically requested no children in this cabin. I paid for first class to get away from exactly this." She said it while looking directly at Lily's ventilator mask sitting on the tray table, waiting to be put on for takeoff, her lip curling slightly like she'd spotted something distasteful on the sidewalk. The flight attendant, a young man named Adrian with a calm professional smile and the kind of patience that comes from years of managing exactly this type of passenger, told her that first-class seating assignments couldn't be adjusted based on passenger preference, and that he was confident it would be a pleasant flight for everyone. She rolled her eyes so hard I heard the sunglasses shift on top of her head, and muttered something to the man walking behind her, a companion who never spoke a single word for the entire flight and seemed to have long ago learned it was easier not to. I noticed, in the small ways you notice things when you've spent a career learning to read a room quickly, that Adrian's expression flickered with something like weary recognition the moment she opened her mouth, The specific look of a person who has encountered this exact type before, more than once on more than one flight. Later, after everything had unfolded, he told me quietly, while we waited for the ground crew to bring Lily's wheelchair up to the jet bridge, that he recognized her, actually recognized her specifically, from a flight nearly a year earlier where she had gotten a family removed from their assigned seats by falsely claiming one of the children had threatened her. He said Delta's internal notes on her account, visible to crew during boarding, flagged a pattern of escalating complaints over the previous 18 months, complaints that had resulted in 2 formal warnings and 1 temporary travel restriction that had since expired. She had, in other words, done this before. She expected, based on every prior experience, to get away with it again. There was, I want to be fair, one moment where she seemed almost human. As she settled into 2A across the aisle from us, she glanced at the elephant in Lily's arms and something flickered across her face. Something that might have been softness, might have been memory, might have been recognition of some child in her own past, a daughter or a niece or a version of herself. She almost smiled, and for one fragile second I thought, maybe this would be fine. Maybe this was just a tired traveler having a rough morning who would settle once we were airborne. Then Lily's ventilator made its quiet startup hum as I switched it on for taxi, testing the seal the way we always do before takeoff, and whatever flicker of humanity had been there vanished completely, replaced by a look of pure, undisguised irritation, her jaw tightening, her eyes narrowing at the small machine like it had personally wronged her. "Is that thing going to be doing that the entire flight?" she said, loud enough for the row behind us to hear, loud enough that I saw the businessman in 2C glance up from his phone for the first time. I told her, gently, that my daughter had a medical condition and that the machine helped her breathe safely at altitude. I said it the way you'd explain something to a person you assumed simply didn't understand yet, giving her every chance, every single benefit of the doubt, to be reasonable, because that is what I always do first in every situation, professional or personal. You start with patience. You start assuming good faith. You escalate only when good faith has been exhausted. "Well, I didn't sign up to sit next to a hospital," she said, waving a hand vaguely in our direction as though the entire concept of Lily's existence was an inconvenient footnote to her travel day. "Some of us are trying to relax." I asked the flight attendant quietly if there was any way to note the disturbance for the flight log, purely as a precaution, the kind of quiet paper trail I've learned to build instinctively in any situation that might escalate. Adrian nodded and said he'd keep an eye on things. She overheard this and laughed, an ugly little laugh with no humor in it. "Oh, are we filing a report? Should I be scared?" 2 men across the aisle exchanged a glance. The particular glance strangers share when they both recognize they're about to witness something unpleasant. A woman in 3C, an older woman with a soft Midwestern voice and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, murmured to her husband, "Lord, here we go," in the exact tired tone of someone who had seen this movie before, more than once, in more than one airport. There was an escalation in between these 2 moments that I haven't mentioned yet, one that in hindsight should have told me exactly what kind of afternoon we were in for. About 40 minutes after takeoff, once the seatbelt sign first switched off, Lily asked if she could take her mask off for a little while. Since we were in a calm stretch of air and Dr. Okafor had cleared short, unmasked intervals when conditions allowed. I checked her oxygen levels on the small monitor clipped to her finger, saw they were holding steady, and told her yes for 20 minutes and set a timer on my phone the way we always do. She beamed at me and immediately reached for her coloring book, the small triumphant satisfaction of a kid who has just been granted a little more freedom than usual. The woman in 2A noticed the mask coming off and apparently decided this was an opening. "See," she said loudly, to her silent companion but clearly intended for the whole cabin. "I told you it was theatrics. The second nobody's watching, off it comes." I told her, calmly, that the mask usage was determined by a pulmonologist based on oxygen saturation levels, not by whether anyone was watching, and that removing it during safe, monitored intervals was a normal and medically approved part of her care plan. She looked entirely unconvinced and said, loud enough for Adrian to hear from 3 rows up, "Kids fake all kinds of things for attention these days. It's a whole culture now." A woman across the aisle in economy turned first class upgrade, a stylish woman in her 30s who had said nothing until this point, actually turned fully around in her seat to stare, open-mouthed, at the audacity of the comment. I said nothing in response, because Lily was sitting right there, coloring book in her lap, and I did not want her to hear one more word out of that woman's mouth about whether her own illness was real. I simply pulled the small privacy divider up slightly higher and gave Lily my full attention instead, letting the comment die in the air unanswered, though it did not die easily inside me. Once we reached cruising altitude, the seatbelt sign switching off with its familiar chime, she escalated. She called Adrian back over and demanded, loudly, that Lily's ventilator be moved to the overhead bin during meal service because the noise in the tubes were bothering her digestion. A claim so absurd that I actually saw Adrian's professional composure flicker for half a second before he caught himself. Adrian explained, patiently, that the device was FAA-approved medical equipment and could not be stowed while in active use. That federal regulations specifically protected passengers' rights to use medical devices during flight. She said, and I quote exactly, "I don't care what the FAA says, I care about my flight." A man in the row behind us, a big guy in a Georgia Bulldog's cap with forearms like a man who worked outdoors for a living, muttered just loud enough for half the cabin to hear, "Ma'am, it's a breathing machine for a child, not a blender." I felt something tighten in my chest, the old familiar tightening I used to feel walking into rooms where I already knew I'd be underestimated. The tightening that comes right before you have to decide how much of yourself to show a situation. I had learned, over 11 years, that the calmest person in a room holding real authority rarely needs to raise their voice, that volume is almost always inversely proportional to actual power. I kept mine level. I told her again, patiently, that we understood the noise was an inconvenience but that it was medically necessary and would only be running intermittently, mostly during takeoff, landing, and turbulence. She looked at me like I had personally insulted her, like my very existence in that seat was an affront to some standard of first-class travel she alone had been appointed to enforce. That was when the first real escalation happened. She reached across the narrow aisle gap, past the tray table, and grabbed the mask itself. The mask, unattached from Lily's face at that moment, resting on the seat back pocket where I'd set it during the calm cruising portion of the flight, and shoved it into the seat pocket in front of her own row, out of easy reach, a small petty act of territorial cruelty. "There," she said, brushing her hands together like she'd just accomplished something meaningful. Problem solved. Lily's face crumpled. Not from fear of the woman, not yet, not at that point, but from confusion, from the sudden absence of something she relied on. Something she'd tapped twice with her finger not 20 minutes earlier, like greeting an old friend before settling in for the flight. "That's mine," Lily said, in the smallest voice I have ever heard come out of my daughter. A voice that still, even in that moment, believed in the basic fairness of the world, believed that adults simply did not do things like this to children. The woman didn't even look at her. "You'll live," she said, and turned back to her magazine like the matter was fully closed. 3 passengers reacted immediately. The man in the Bulldog's cap stood halfway out of his seat before his wife's hand on his forearm pulled him back down. A woman near the galley, sharp New York vowels cutting through the cabin like a blade, said, "Are you kidding me right now? Give the kid back her stuff." The soft-spoken woman in 3C reached forward and touched my shoulder gently. The universal gesture of "I see you. I'm here. I am not going to pretend this isn't happening." I retrieved the mask calmly, leaning across the aisle myself since she showed no intention of returning it. I did not raise my voice. I said, evenly, "I'm going to need you to never touch my daughter's medical equipment again." She scoffed, arms crossed, utterly certain she had already won whatever this was, whatever game she believed herself to be playing. "Or what?" she said. "You'll write another strongly worded email?" I did not answer her. I simply reattached the mask to Lily's face, checked the seal with the quick practiced motion of a mother who has done this hundreds of times, and watched my daughter's small shoulders relax as the air began flowing correctly again. Watched the tension drain from her little body the way it always does once the mask settles into place. Inside, though, something else had shifted in me. In my line of work, there's a specific, particular quiet that settles over you right before you have to do something you'd rather not do, but absolutely will, a stillness that colleagues who've worked with me for years have learned to recognize and, frankly, to fear a little. That quiet had arrived. The plane hit a stretch of light chop about 90 minutes in, right as meal service wrapped and the flight attendants were clearing trays down the aisle. It was nothing serious, just enough to rattle the ice in people's cups and make the overhead bins creak faintly, But it was enough for the woman in 2A to decide the entire flight was now Lily's fault, as though a 7-year-old with a breathing condition could somehow be personally responsible for atmospheric conditions at 31,000 feet. This is exactly why children shouldn't be flying first class, she announced to no one and everyone at once, her voice pitched to Carrie. Everything about this row has been a disaster since we boarded. She reached over a second time, this time for Lily's tray table itself, snapping it up hard enough that Lily's juice cup toppled and spilled across the carpet between our seats, a small dark stain spreading across the pale gray fabric. Lily flinched at the sudden noise and grabbed for her ventilator mask instinctively, a pure reflex reaction, the strap catching wrong against her cheek in her panic, leaving a thin red mark along her jaw. She started to cry, quiet tears, the kind of crying that happens when a child doesn't understand why an adult is being cruel to them and hasn't yet learned the world contains people like this, people who see a small vulnerable person and decide, consciously or not, that this vulnerability makes them an acceptable target rather than someone deserving of extra gentleness. Adrian arrived within seconds, kneeling to help clean the spill. His jaw tight with a controlled anger, I could see him working hard to suppress under his uniform's professional calm. "Ma'am, I need to ask you not to touch this family's belongings again or their equipment," he said, firmer this time, his voice carrying a warning underneath the professional courtesy. She waved him off with a flick of her wrist as though swatting a fly from a picnic table. "I'll touch whatever is in my personal space," she said. "This is a public cabin, not a hospital room." The bulldog's cap man, watching Lily cry over her spilled juice and her reddened cheek, finally stood all the way up this time, his wife's restraining hand no longer enough to hold him in his seat. "Ma'am, I don't know what kind of day you're having, but that little girl didn't do a single thing to you," he said, his Georgia drawl thick with barely restrained anger. "You need to sit back and leave that family alone." The woman turned on him with the practiced outrage of someone who has spent a lifetime deflecting criticism onto whoever offers it. "This is none of your business," she snapped. "Mind your own row." He didn't sit down right away. He stood there another few seconds, arms crossed, until Adrian gently touched his shoulder and asked him, quietly, to give him room to handle it, and only then did he lower himself back into his seat, muttering something to his wife that ended in the word, "unbelievable." The New York woman near the galley had abandoned all pretense of staying out of it by this point. She'd unbuckled and walked halfway up the aisle, phone in hand, not recording yet but clearly ready to. "You want to explain to me," she said, hands on her hips, "why a grown woman is out here terrorizing a kid with a breathing machine? Because from where I'm standing, that's exactly what this looks like." The woman in 2A waved a dismissive hand at her too. "Everyone needs to mind their own business today," she said, though her voice had lost some of its earlier confidence, a slight waver creeping in now that the whole cabin had clearly turned against her. The soft-spoken woman in 3C, normally content to murmur quietly to her husband, spoke up for the first time directly, her Midwestern voice gentle but unmistakably firm. "Honey," she said, addressing Lily directly rather than the woman across the aisle, "you are just the sweetest thing, and none of this is your fault, not one bit of it. You hear me?" Lily, still sniffling, nodded at her, and something in the older woman's kind, steady gaze seemed to settle her more than anything I could have said in that moment. Not rage exactly, something colder, something with a very long memory, the kind of cold that settles into your spine and stays there. I had testified in front of committees that could shape federal policy without so much as a raised eyebrow. I had sat through 4-hour negotiations where the wrong word could tank an international agreement affecting millions of people. I did not lose my composure easily. It is, I would say, one of the specific professional skills I have spent a career cultivating. But watching my daughter's hand tremble as she reached for her own mask, watching a thin red welt rise on her cheek because a stranger decided her comfort mattered more than a child's ability to breathe, that cracked something in me that 30 years of professional discipline had built brick by brick, something that had absorbed slights and insults and worse from people far more dangerous than the woman in seat 2A and had never once given them the satisfaction of a reaction. I did not shout. I want to be clear about that, because what happened next is more terrifying in its quietness than any shouting could ever be. I unbuckled my seatbelt, knelt down beside Lily on the cabin floor, wiped her tears with my thumb, checked the strap where it had caught against her cheek, and told her, "You are safe. I am right here. Nothing is going to touch you again." Then I looked up at the woman across the aisle, and I said one sentence, quiet enough that only the surrounding rows could hear it clearly. "You have made a mistake today that you cannot undo." She laughed. Actual laughter. Head tipped back. Sunglasses sliding down her nose as her shoulders shook with the sheer absurdity of my warning in her mind. "Oh, please. What are you going to do? Have your little PTA committee send me a fruit basket?" I didn't answer. I simply reached into my jacket, the same jacket I had worn onto this plane 6 hours earlier without a single soul noticing what was tucked inside it, and I pulled out my phone. I stepped slightly into the aisle for privacy, though there was little enough of it to be had in that cramped space, and I made one call. It lasted 11 seconds. I said 4 words into it, quietly, calmly, and I hung up, tucking the phone back into my jacket pocket with the same unhurried motion I'd used to put away a pen. Adrian, who had been standing in the aisle watching this entire exchange with growing unease, went very still when he heard the tone of my voice on that call, a tone entirely different from anything he'd heard from me over the last several hours. He glanced toward the cockpit door. He glanced back at me. Something in his posture changed completely, the professional ease replaced by something sharper, more alert, more careful, the way a person stands differently once they suspect the ground beneath them has shifted. He said, quietly, almost to himself, "Ma'am, are you?" And then stopped himself before finishing the sentence, like he already suspected the answer and didn't quite believe it yet, like some instinct in him had recognized something before his conscious mind had caught up. The soft-voiced woman in 3C leaned toward her husband and whispered something I couldn't hear, but I saw her eyes widen slightly, saw her glance at me with an expression that was somewhere between recognition and disbelief, the particular look of someone piecing together a puzzle from fragments. She had seen something, maybe the small pin on my lapel, easy to miss unless you knew exactly what you were looking for, a detail that means nothing to 99 people out of 100 and everything to the 100th. Maybe just the way the flight attendant's whole demeanor had shifted in an instant, the way professional deference sometimes hardens into something closer to alertness. The woman across the aisle noticed none of this. She was too busy adjusting her sunglasses and telling the man next to her, loud enough for the whole cabin to hear, that she hoped somebody finally learned some manners today. She thought the silence around her meant she had won, that the cabin's quiet was capitulation rather than the held breath before something breaks. She had no idea the entire cabin's temperature had just changed, and that she was the only person on that airplane who hadn't felt it happen. She leaned back in her seat, satisfied, arms crossed, chin lifted in a posture of complete victory, the posture of a woman thoroughly convinced the universe had just confirmed her own righteousness. "Some of us," she announced to the row, to the cabin, to anyone still listening, "actually know how to fly like adults." She smiled at her own reflection in the window, checking her hair with one hand, entirely unaware that 3 rows back, the man in the bulldog's cap had already pulled out his own phone and quietly begun recording, that the New York woman near the galley had caught Adrian's eye and mouthed something to him that looked very much like, "Is she in trouble?" That the whole cabin had shifted, almost imperceptibly, into the posture of an audience watching a story they already sensed the ending to. For those few minutes, the cabin held a very particular kind of silence, the kind that exists in the space between a lit fuse and an explosion, quiet but charged, everyone sensing that something significant was underway without yet knowing its exact shape. I sat very still beside Lily, one hand resting lightly on her small shoulder, feeling the steady mechanical rhythm of her ventilator beneath my palm, and I let myself have one private, quiet moment of my own before whatever came next. I thought about all the rooms I had sat in over the past 11 years where I had learned to wait exactly like this, patient and unhurried, letting the person across from me believe, for just a little longer, that they still held the advantage. I thought about how strange it was that the same skill I had built in negotiating rooms with global consequence would end up being used, on an ordinary Tuesday, to protect my own daughter on an airplane. Lily, sensing something in my stillness, looked up at me and whispered, "Mom, are you okay?" And I told her, honestly, "I'm about to be, sweetheart. Just watch." What none of them knew, not even the perceptive woman in 3C, was exactly what that phone call had set into motion, or exactly what would be waiting for us on the ground in less than 2 hours. The 4 words I had spoken into that phone, quiet and unremarkable to anyone listening, had been enough to mobilize a small, precise machinery that most Americans never see in motion. A machinery built for situations far graver than an entitled passenger and a mistreated child, but perfectly capable, when needed, of being redirected toward exactly this kind of quiet, private justice instead. I reached into my jacket again. This time I did not make a call. I placed a small leather folio on my tray table. I did not open it right away. I let it sit there for a moment, closed, unremarkable to anyone who didn't already understand what it was, the way the most consequential objects often look completely ordinary right up until the moment they aren't. She looked down at it, still smiling, still certain of herself, still convinced whatever it was couldn't possibly matter to her. I opened it. Karen looked down at it. And for the first time since she had boarded this flight, she went completely silent. The seal inside that folio is not something most Americans ever see up close in their lifetime. It is not something you can buy, borrow, or fake convincingly, and every federal officer within 100 feet of one instinctively recognizes it the second it catches the light, the way certain sounds trigger a reflex before conscious thought ever catches up. Adrian saw it over my shoulder and actually took a half step backward, the way you step back from something you suddenly understand is much bigger than you assumed, his hand going briefly to the small radio clipped near his collar. The soft-voiced woman in 3C put her hand to her chest, her mouth forming a small, silent O. The man in the bulldog's cap sat up so straight he nearly hit his head on the overhead bin, and I saw him mouth something to his wife that looked very much like "no way." Confusion moved across the woman's face first, the particular confusion of someone whose brain is trying to process information faster than her ego will allow her to accept it. Her eyes darting between the folio and my face like she was waiting for the punchline of a joke she didn't yet understand. Then came disbelief, her mouth opening and closing without producing sound, the sunglasses finally sliding all the way off the top of her head and clattering, forgotten, onto her tray table. Then recognition arrived, slow and total, draining the color from her face the way water drains from a tub, her hands going still in her lap for the first time since boarding. And then, finally, panic, real, undignified, cornered animal panic, the kind that no amount of expensive blazer or blown-out hair can disguise, the kind that strips away every ounce of the entitlement she'd been wearing like armor for the last 2 hours. "You're," she started, and couldn't finish the sentence, her voice cracking on the single word. "Vice President of the United States," I said quietly. "For the next 18 months, at least. And for the record, that folder isn't the interesting part. The interesting part is that you just assaulted a disabled 7-year-old's federally regulated medical device in front of 11 witnesses, a flight crew, and a sitting constitutional officer on a commercial aircraft, which happens to fall under federal jurisdiction the second those wheels left the ground." The cabin had gone completely silent except for the low, steady hum of Lily's ventilator, still doing its patient, faithful work, still keeping my daughter breathing exactly the way it was supposed to, a small mechanical heartbeat underneath the sudden hush. Adrian was already speaking quietly into the intercom handset, his back half-turned toward us for privacy, his voice low and clipped. The captain's voice came over the cabin speakers moments later, calm and clipped in the specific tone pilots use when they need everyone in the cabin to understand something is serious without inciting panic. "Folks, this is your captain speaking. We're going to remain at cruising altitude as planned, and I want to thank everyone for their patience today. We do have law enforcement being notified ahead of our arrival regarding an incident in the forward cabin. Please remain seated with your belongings secure, and we'll have you on the ground in Washington right on schedule." The rewatch detail is this. Earlier in the flight, when Adrian first approached our row to check on Lily during boarding, he had paused for just a fraction of a second longer than protocol required before saying, "Of course, ma'am, we'll take good care of you both today," a phrase slightly more formal than his usual friendly cabin patter with other passengers. At the time, it seemed like nothing. In hindsight, Delta's onboard systems flag certain manifest entries for crew awareness without ever specifying why, and Adrian, a 9-year veteran of the airline, had clearly been trained to recognize what that flag meant, even if he'd never expected to actually need that training on a routine Tuesday afternoon flight from Orlando. There is a second detail, easy to miss the first time through, buried in something the soft-spoken woman in 3C said almost an hour before any of this happened. Early in the flight, before the trouble had even started. She had leaned over during a lull and told her husband, apropos of nothing, that she thought she recognized me from some committee hearing thing she'd half-watched on television months earlier, and her husband had laughed it off, telling her every brunette woman in her 40s looks like someone off the news to her lately. She hadn't pushed the thought further at the time, filing it away the way you file away a face that seems familiar without quite placing it. But the moment my phone call went out and Adrian's posture changed, I watched recognition finally click into place behind her eyes, the delayed satisfaction of a memory finally locating its source. And there is a third detail, the smallest of the three, that I doubt more than a handful of people on that entire aircraft would ever have caught. When the woman in 2A first boarded and complained to Adrian about being seated near children, Adrian had glanced, very briefly, down at his handheld boarding device before responding to her, a glance that in the moment looked like nothing more than routine screen checking. It was not routine. It was him confirming, silently, exactly which two passengers in row 1 carried the manifest flag he'd been trained to recognize, information he would carry quietly for the next 2 hours without a single outward sign, right up until the moment it mattered. She tried to recover. Of course she did. People like her always try. I didn't know, she said, her voice suddenly small, suddenly desperate for an exit that no longer existed, her hands twisting together in her lap. If I had known who you were, I never would have. That's exactly the problem, I said, and I kept my voice level quiet, the voice I use in rooms where the temperature has already been set by someone else's cruelty and my job is simply not to match it, only to make sure it lands where it belongs. You didn't need to know who I am to know that what you were doing was wrong. You needed to know that a child was struggling to breathe. That should have been enough information all on its own. The New York woman near the galley actually stood up and clapped, once, sharp and satisfied, before catching herself and sitting back down, murmuring sorry to no one in particular. The Bulldog's cat man said, low but audible, yes ma'am, in the tone of someone watching a verdict get read in a courtroom. The soft-spoken Midwestern woman in 3C just nodded slowly, over and over, like she'd been waiting her whole life to watch someone like this finally meet a consequence, tears standing unshed in her eyes. She tried again. It was just a misunderstanding. I have kids of my own. I would never actually want to hurt. You didn't want to hurt her, I said. You just didn't care whether you did. That's worse. She opened her mouth once more, and this time nothing came out at all. She simply sat there, hands trembling slightly in her lap, sunglasses forgotten on the tray table beside the leather folio she couldn't stop glancing at, as though checking it hadn't disappeared, as though some part of her still hoped this was a mistake that would resolve itself before we landed. For the remainder of the flight, roughly 40 minutes, the cabin existed in a strange, suspended quiet. Nobody spoke to her. Nobody spoke much at all, actually, beyond quiet murmurs between seatmates and the occasional soft question from Adrian checking on Lily's comfort, bringing her a fresh apple juice without being asked, kneeling down to tell her, quietly, that she was the bravest passenger he'd ever had the pleasure of flying with. Lily, recovered now, mask securely in place, watched the whole unfolding scene with the particular solemn attention of a child who understands something important is happening even if she doesn't understand all of it. Occasionally leaning her head against my arm and whispering questions I answered as simply and honestly as I could. Is that lady in trouble? Yes, baby. Because she took my mask? Yes, and because of some other things too. Are you really the vice president? I am. Sweetheart. I'm sorry I never told you at the theme park. I try not to make our vacations about that. She considered this for a long moment and then said, with the particular gravity only a 7-year-old can summon, I think that's a really good secret to keep. Something else happened during that suspended, quiet stretch of the flight that I haven't mentioned, something small but that has stuck with me since. The businessman in 2C, who had spent the entire flight up to that point buried in his phone, apparently working through some deal or another, closed his laptop entirely somewhere around the time the captain's announcement finished, and turned to look at Lily for a long moment. Then he reached into his bag and pulled out a small deck of playing cards, the kind business travelers carry for exactly this sort of dead time, and leaned across the aisle to ask her, gently, if she wanted to play a quiet game to pass the rest of the flight. Lily, still a little shaken but brightening at the attention, said yes, and the two of them played several rounds of a simplified version of war for the remainder of the descent. Her small stack of cards growing steadily as he, not at all subtly, let her win most of the hands. I have thought about that man more than almost anyone else from that flight. A total stranger who said not one word about the incident itself, who simply understood, instinctively, that what a frightened child needed most in that moment was not more conversation about what had happened to her, but something ordinary and light to hold her attention until it was over. By the time we landed at Dulles, two federal air marshals who had been quietly repositioned mid-flight met the aircraft at the jet bridge, along with an FAA compliance officer and a representative from Delta's corporate security division who had clearly been briefed the moment my call went through at altitude. She was asked, calmly but firmly, to remain in her seat while every other passenger deplaned first. A small but meaningful humiliation, forced to sit in the very seat where she'd committed her offense while the entire cabin filed past her one by one. I watched her face as row after row of people filed past her, several of them making sure to look directly at her as they passed, the New York woman pausing just long enough to say, "Hope it was worth it, hun?" before continuing down the aisle with her carry-on rolling behind her. The Bulldog's cap man paused too, just briefly, and said nothing at all, just looked at her with an expression that somehow communicated more disappointment than any words could have. The consequences arrived one at a time, and each one landed with its own separate, specific weight, the way a verdict is read count by count rather than all at once. First, the FAA compliance officer, a precise, unhurried woman named Special Agent Reyes, informed her that interfering with an operating medical device on a commercial aircraft carried federal penalties independent of any state or airline action. Penalties that could include substantial fines and, depending on the findings of a full investigation, potential criminal referral. Second, Delta's security representative, a tall man in a dark suit who introduced himself only by his last name, Coleman, informed her, in front of the remaining crew, that she was being placed on the airline's permanent no-fly list effective immediately, pending the outcome of the investigation. A designation that would also be shared, per long-standing industry agreements, with several partner carriers. Third, one of the air marshals, a quiet, serious man who had said almost nothing until this point, informed her that given the presence of a federal officer among the affected parties, this incident would be referred directly for review regarding aggravated interference charges, which is a felony matter, not a civil one, and that she should expect to be contacted by federal investigators within the week. She tried to talk her way out of every single one of these. She tried appealing to the marshals with a story about a rough divorce and a stressful year, her voice cracking in a way that might have moved me under different circumstances, if I hadn't watched her spend the last 2 hours treating my daughter's ability to breathe as a minor annoyance. She tried appealing to Delta's representative with the fact that she was a longtime Diamond Medallion member, as though frequent flyer status could somehow purchase forgiveness for what she'd done. She tried, at one truly remarkable low point, appealing directly to me, asking if there was any way we could handle this privately as women. A phrase that landed in that cabin like a small, ugly stone. I told her, calmly, that the time to handle this privately as women had been 6 hours earlier, on the airplane, when she'd had every opportunity to simply be decent to a stranger's frightened child, and that she had chosen very differently every single time that opportunity presented itself. There was a fourth consequence, delivered almost as an afterthought by Agent Reyes, but one that seemed to land harder than any of the others. She informed the woman that the incident report, once finalized, would be forwarded as a matter of routine procedure to her employer's compliance office, since her boarding pass had been purchased under a corporate travel account, meaning her company's human resources department would receive formal notice of a federal aviation violation committed on a business trip. I watched something in the woman's face collapse at that particular piece of news in a way it hadn't for the others. The fine and the no-fly list and even the felony referral somehow more abstract to her than the very specific, very immediate humiliation of her employer finding out exactly how she had behaved on an ordinary Tuesday flight home. She asked, in a voice gone suddenly thin and pleading, whether there was any way to keep that particular piece separate from the rest, whether her job might somehow be spared from all this. Agent Reyes told her, without unkindness but without any give either, that federal incident reports don't come with an option for selective disclosure, and that perhaps she should have considered her employer's reaction before she reached for a stranger's child's breathing mask on a plane. Coleman, the Delta security representative, added that the airline's own incident documentation, separate from the federal report, would also be retained on permanent file, meaning any future flight on any carrier using the shared industry no-fly database would flag her name automatically, indefinitely, with no stated expiration. Passengers who had already deplaned lingered near the gate area, watching through the glass, several of them recording quietly on their phones, not out of cruelty, but out of the simple human need to witness a thing finally being made right. The way people slow down at the end of a long, unfair story just to see it land somewhere fair. Among them was the stylish woman from the economy cabin upgrade who had turned around in her seat earlier at the comment about Lily faking her illness. She stood near the gate agent's podium with her arms crossed, watching the whole scene with a small, satisfied nod, like she'd been waiting specifically to see this part. When the last consequence was read to her, formally by Agent Reyes, a small ripple of applause moved through the small crowd gathered at the gate. Not loud, not triumphant, just quiet and relieved, like a held breath finally being released after being held far too long. I want to be honest about something here because I think it matters to the shape of this whole story. Watching those consequences land, one after another, did not feel like victory to me the way I might have expected it to. It felt mostly like exhaustion, the particular exhaustion that comes after a long day of having to be the adult in a room that badly needed one, mixed with a low undercurrent of sadness that any of it had been necessary in the first place. I did not feel triumphant watching a stranger's life come apart in front of a gate full of onlookers, even a stranger who had earned every bit of what was happening to her. I felt mostly relieved that it was over, and tired in the particular way you're tired after carrying something heavy for much longer than you should have had to. At one point, near the very end of the gate proceedings, she looked directly at me, her composure finally, completely gone, mascara smudged faintly beneath one eye though I never saw her actually cry, and said the only thing she said to me that entire final hour that sounded like it might have contained a real thought rather than a defense. "I don't even know why I did that," she said, quietly, almost to herself. "I don't know why I couldn't just let it go." I didn't answer her. I don't think there was an answer I could have given that would have meant anything to her in that moment, and honestly, I'm not sure it was a question meant for me at all. I think it was the first honest thing she'd said all day, the first crack in a lifetime of assuming the world owed her comfort at any cost, and I hope, for her own sake as much as anyone else's, that she sits with that question for a very long time. Agent Reyes handed her a business card before the marshals finally escorted her toward a private processing room away from the gate area. The small mundane gesture that closes out even the most dramatic federal encounters. A phone number to call. A case number to reference. Instructions about when to expect further contact from investigators. The last I saw of her, she was being led down a service corridor most passengers never see. Her expensive garment bag now looking somehow smaller slung over her shoulder. Her companion trailing a few steps behind her, still silent, still saying nothing at all, the way he apparently had for the entire relationship, whatever that relationship actually was. I did not join the applause. I knelt down instead, next to Lily's wheelchair, which the ground crew had brought up to the jet bridge for her, and I helped straighten her elephant in her lap and gently checked the strap of her mask where the red mark from earlier had already started to fade to a faint pink line. She looked up at me and said, in that same small, brave voice she'd used the entire flight, "Is it over now?" "It's over," I told her. "You never have to think about her again." I gave the woman across the jet bridge one final look before we were escorted toward our connecting ground transport. I was not angry when I said it. I want you to understand that clearly because anger would have given her something to hold on to, something to resent, something to make the story about her again. And I had learned a long time ago that the people who hurt others rarely learn anything from anger, they only learn to feel sorry for themselves. Instead I said it the way you deliver a verdict, plainly, without heat. You spent an entire flight deciding a child's breathing was less important than your comfort. I hope every single consequence you're about to face teaches you that it never will be again. Then I turned and walked my daughter toward the elevator, and I did not look back, not even once, though I could feel her eyes on my back the entire way. The following weeks brought their own quiet aftermath, the kind that doesn't make headlines but shapes a family's life in smaller, more permanent ways. There was a moment 3 days later, sitting in Lily's room while she slept with her stuffed elephant tucked under one arm and her ventilator humming its quiet familiar rhythm beside her bed, when everything finally caught up with me at once, and I cried, quietly. The kind of crying you do when you finally let yourself feel something you've been holding at arm's length out of necessity for far too long. It wasn't about the woman on the plane, not really. It was about my daughter's small hand reaching for a mask that wasn't there, about 11 seconds of gray lips I will never fully stop seeing when I close my eyes at night, about how close we had come, in a moment of someone else's petty cruelty, to a very different kind of story entirely. Mark found me there, sitting on the edge of Lily's bed in the dark, and he didn't say anything at first. He just sat down beside me and put his arm around my shoulders and let me cry until I was done, the way he has always known how to do since the day we met. When I finally told him everything, the whole story, start to finish, he was quiet for a long moment, and then he said the thing that has stayed with me more than almost anything else from that entire week. "You know the badge didn't do that," he said. "You did that. The badge just made sure people believed you the first time." He told me, too, that he wished he had been there, not because he doubted I'd handled it correctly, but because some part of him, some old protective instinct that predates every title either of us has ever held, simply wished he could have been the one kneeling on that cabin floor beside our daughter. I told him I understood completely, that I had thought of him more than once during those 2 hours, had wondered what he would have said, how his particular steady calm might have shaped the encounter differently. We sat together a long time that night, past when either of us should have gone to sleep, talking through every detail I could remember, the two of us processing together what I had mostly had to process alone at 31,000 feet, and by the time we finally turned off the light, something in my chest that had been clenched tight since that moment on the plane had finally, quietly begun to loosen. There was another moment, a week later, when Lily looked up at me over a bowl of macaroni and said, completely deadpan, "Mom, are you actually a superhero? Like for real? For real?" And I laughed, really laughed, the seal bark laugh she loves to make fun of, because after everything that had happened, that was exactly the kind of question only a 7-year-old could ask with a perfectly straight face, and it was exactly what I needed to hear, exactly the kind of lightness our house needed after a week that had otherwise felt very heavy. There was a third moment, less pleasant but no less important, when Lily's pulmonologist, Dr. Okafor, called to check in after hearing about the incident through the hospital's patient advocacy office, which had been contacted as part of the federal investigation's documentation process. He told me gently that in his 15 years of practice he had heard dozens of stories about families struggling with airline staff over medical equipment, that our story was, unfortunately, not as rare as I might have hoped, and that most of those families did not have a federal badge in their jacket to make sure the world listened the first time. That conversation sat with me for a long time afterward, longer than almost anything else that came out of that week, because it reminded me how much of what happened to us that day was not actually about power at all, but about the fact that a 7-year-old's right to breathe safely should never have required a vice president sitting beside her to be respected in the first place. About a month after the flight, I received a handwritten letter forwarded through Delta's corporate offices, from Adrian. He wrote that he'd flown for the airline for 9 years and had, in that time, dealt with more difficult passengers than he could count, but that he had never once, before that flight, seen a situation resolved with so little noise and so much certainty. He said watching me kneel down next to Lily on the cabin floor, entirely unconcerned with my own dignity in that moment, had taught him something about leadership he intended to carry with him for the rest of his career, in whatever direction that career eventually took him. He included, at the bottom of the letter, a small hand-drawn elephant, clumsy and endearing, that he said was for Lily. From her co-pilot on the worst flight of her year. She keeps that drawing taped to the wall beside her bed, next to a photo of her and Marcus from the theme park, 2 small mementos of 2 different strangers who chose kindness on the same difficult trip. I also heard, some weeks later, through the FAA compliance office, that Agent Reyes had used our case, with names withheld, in a training module for new inspectors on how interference cases involving medical devices should be handled with both firmness and compassion for the affected family. I don't know how much good that training module will actually do in the world. Policy training modules are small, unglamorous things, easy to dismiss as bureaucratic box-checking. But I have learned, over 11 years in this work, that small, unglamorous things are very often exactly how the world actually gets better, one training module, one policy memo, one quietly revised procedure at a time, long after the dramatic parts of any given story have been forgotten by everyone except the people who lived them. The woman from that flight was formally charged 11 days later with interference with a medical device on an aircraft and a federal aviation violation carrying significant fines. in addition to being permanently barred from flying with Delta and 3 partner airlines under their shared no-fly agreement. Her name, at her attorney's request and mine, will not appear in this story, because this was never actually about her. It never is with people like her. It's about the 11 seconds it took before my daughter's lips changed color, and the fact that not one single second of that should have ever been allowed to happen in the first place. I later learned, through channels I won't detail here, that she did eventually enter a plea agreement rather than face trial, one that included a substantial fine, a term of probation, and a formal, court-documented apology that Lily has never read and, at my insistence, never will, because some closures belong to the adults in a story, not the children. What I keep coming back to, more than the badge, more than the felony referral, more than the applause at the gate, is the sound my daughter made when that woman first grabbed her mask. That small, stunned, "That's mine," said in a voice that still believed, even in that moment, that the world was fundamentally fair, that adults were fundamentally kind, that a machine that helps you breathe would obviously be respected by anyone with a working conscience. I think about how much I want to protect that belief in her for as long as I possibly can, and how grateful I am that on that particular day, I happen to have the power to make sure the world proved her right instead of wrong, even though I know, with a heaviness that never fully leaves me, that most parents in that exact situation would not have had that power, and would have had to watch their child's belief in the world's basic decency take a hit it might never fully recover from. Every parent on earth understands what it feels like to watch someone hurt their child and to feel that specific, ancient fire rise up in their chest, whether they carry a federal badge in their jacket or not. Some of us just happen to have a few more tools available when it's time to make things right, but the fire itself, the refusal to let your child's pain be treated as an inconvenience, belongs to every single parent who has ever sat beside a hospital bed and promised their child that nothing would ever hurt them again if they could help it. A promise every parent makes at some point in hopes, desperately, never to be tested on. If you had told me, 6 hours before that flight, that I'd spend the trip home from Orlando making a phone call that would end someone's flying privileges permanently, I wouldn't have believed you. I would have told you that day was supposed to be about butterfly tattoos and stuffed elephants and the particular exhausted happiness of a family finally getting to go home after a good trip. But if you ask my daughter what she remembers most about that day, months later now, with the mark on her cheek long since faded and the whole incident tucked away in the specific corner of her memory where children file away things that frighten them and then resolved, she won't tell you about the woman in 2A at all. She'll tell you about the elephant Marcus gave her at the theme park, and the monarch butterfly tattoo that took 3 days to wash off, and the way her mom held her hand the entire flight home, and that's exactly the way I intend to keep it, for as long as I possibly can. Lily still taps her mask twice before putting it on, every single time, the same small greeting she's given that machine since a hospital room 2 years ago. She did it on our next flight 6 weeks later, a short hop to visit my parents in Richmond, completely unbothered, completely unafraid, the way only a child who has been thoroughly reassured by the adults around her can be. I watched her do it and felt something settle in my chest that had not fully settled since that afternoon over the Atlantic seaboard. A quiet confirmation that whatever else had happened that day, we had managed to protect the one thing that mattered most, which was not my daughter's body, though that mattered enormously too, but her small, stubborn, beautiful trust that the world, on balance, would still turn out to be kind to her. I think about that flight almost every day now, in some small way or another, the way you think about the moments that reveal something true about who you actually are underneath everything else you've built for yourself. I think about how easy it would have been to let that anger consume the whole encounter, to raise my voice, to match her cruelty with something equally sharp, and how much less the story would have mattered if I had. I think about how the quietest response is so often the most powerful one, not because quiet is inherently virtuous, but because quiet forces people to sit with the full weight of what they've actually done, without the noise of a shouting match to distract them from it. That is a lesson I try to carry into every part of my work now, in rooms far more consequential than an airplane cabin, and it is a lesson I hope, more than almost anything else, that my daughter carries with her too, long after she's forgotten the exact details of a bad afternoon on a Delta flight from Orlando. A few months after all of this, I was asked to speak at a small, closed-door roundtable on disability accommodations in commercial travel, one of those quiet policy gatherings that never makes the news but occasionally moves the smallest gears of something larger. I almost said no. Part of the anonymity I fought so hard to protect for Lily's sake meant I rarely connected my public work to my private life in any visible way, and some instinct in me resisted the idea of using what happened to her as a talking point. But Mark encouraged me to go, and Dr. Okafor, when I mentioned it to him, told me something that changed my mind entirely. He said that for every family like ours who happened to have the specific, unlikely leverage to force real consequences out of a bad situation, there were hundreds of families who did not, who simply absorbed the cruelty, apologized for existing, and got off the plane feeling smaller than when they'd boarded. He asked me gently whether I thought that was fair, and I told him honestly that I didn't, and that was the whole reason I decided to go. At that round table, I did not tell the full story of what happened on that flight. I kept Lily's name out of it entirely, kept the details general, framed it as a hypothetical drawn from conversations with affected families, rather than my own life, because I have always tried to keep my daughter's story hers to tell, not mine to spend. But I did say one thing plainly, without hedging, to a room full of airline executives and regulators who had the power to change actual policy. I told them that no family should ever need a federal officer sitting in the next seat for their child's medical equipment to be treated as non-negotiable, and that if the system only worked because I happened to carry a badge that day, then the system was fundamentally broken for everyone who didn't. I don't know yet what will come of that conversation. Policy moves slowly, and I've learned not to expect fast miracles from rooms full of careful, cautious people. But I said it, and I meant it, and I intend to keep saying it in every room I'm allowed into for as long as I hold this office. There is a version of this story, I know, that some people will want to hear as simple and satisfying, a story where a cruel woman gets exactly what she deserves and everyone goes home feeling righteous. I understand that impulse, and honestly, some days I feel it myself. But the more complicated truth, the one I sit with at night sometimes when the house is quiet and Lily's ventilator is humming faithfully down the hall, is that justice arriving for us that day was mostly a matter of luck, of circumstance, of the specific accident that put me in that particular seat on that particular flight. Justice should not require luck. It should not require a vice president happening to be present. It should be the baseline, ordinary expectation for every parent boarding every flight with a child who needs a little more care than the passenger next to them might be used to seeing. I think, too, about the version of me that existed before all of this, the girl who grew up above her father's hardware store in a town most people have never heard of, who never imagined she'd end up in rooms with this much consequence attached to them. I think about what that girl would have made of a story like this one, a story where the ordinary cruelty of a stranger on an airplane gets met, eventually, with the full and considerable weight of federal law. I think she would have found it almost unbelievable, the way most people find the idea of real accountability almost unbelievable these days, because so much of what we see in the world teaches us that cruelty mostly goes unanswered, that the loud and entitled mostly get away with it, that the rest of us are supposed to simply absorb what happens to us and move on quietly. I want this story to push back against that lesson at least a little. I want every parent who has ever sat on a plane holding their child's hand a little too tightly, bracing for the next unkind comment about a wheelchair or a mask or a service animal or a meltdown, to know that the cruelty they've absorbed was never actually acceptable, badge or no badge, power or no power, and that somewhere, someone is fighting to make sure it stops being treated as an acceptable cost of traveling while disabled. My daughter is doing wonderfully now, for whatever that's worth to you at the end of a story like this one. Her pulmonologist recently told us her nerve function has shown small, encouraging signs of improvement, the kind of slow progress that autoimmune conditions sometimes allow for, though he's careful never to promise anything beyond what the data actually supports. She started a new session of adaptive soccer last month and scored her very first goal, an event she narrated to me afterward with the same solemn documentary tone she uses for clouds shaped like walruses, describing the exact trajectory of the ball with a level of technical detail that made her coach laugh out loud. She still taps her mask twice before putting it on. She still collects the smiles of strangers like small treasures and reports them back to me days later, unprompted, as though she's been keeping a private ledger this whole time of who in this world has been kind to her. I don't know what she'll remember years from now about that flight home from Orlando. Children's memories are strange and selective things, and I've long since stopped trying to predict which parts of a hard day will stick and which will simply dissolve. But I know what I want her to carry forward from it, if anything survives at all. I want her to remember that her mother knelt down on an airplane floor in front of strangers and told her she was safe, and meant it completely. I want her to remember that when someone tried to make her feel small, an entire cabin full of strangers, people she'd never met and would likely never see again, stood up in their own small ways to tell her she mattered. And I want her to remember, more than anything else, that being different, being someone who needs a little more care than the person next to her, was never something to apologize for, Not on that flight, not anywhere, not ever. I think, in the end, that is the whole reason I've told you this story at all. More than the badge, more than the felony charge, more than the small satisfying justice of watching consequences land one after another at a gate in Dulles. Somewhere out there tonight, there is another parent boarding another flight with another child who breathes a little differently, moves a little differently, needs a little more patience than the stranger in the next seat is prepared to offer. I cannot promise that parent, a vice president, will happen to be sitting nearby when things go wrong. Most of the time, that will not be true, and most of the time, that parent will simply have to absorb whatever cruelty comes their way and get off the plane feeling smaller than they should have to. But I can tell that parent this much, honestly, from someone who has now sat on both sides of that particular kind of helplessness. Your child's need for care is not an inconvenience to anyone with a working conscience, and the next time someone tries to make you feel otherwise, you have every right, badge or no badge, to say so plainly and to keep saying it until someone finally listens. That, more than anything else, is what I hope you take with you from this story. Not the satisfaction of watching a cruel woman lose her flying privileges, though I understand if that part stays with you the longest. But the quieter, harder truth underneath it, that the 11 seconds it took for my daughter's lips to change color should never have been possible in the first place, on that flight or any other, and that every single one of us, whether we carry a federal badge or not, has the power to make sure a frightened child on an airplane never again has to wonder whether the adults around her will choose kindness or cruelty when it matters most.